Chapter 13. In the spring of 1910. I was riding in the area of the old L7 headquarters again one day early in April, so stopped in to visit George and Mattie Adams and the baby. I found the house deserted and in complete disorder. Mattie's dress and shoes were scattered around, and the baby's things were all here. I went to the barn and found George's saddle, but no bridle. The little horse pasture gate was open, and I saw Mrs. Adams' tracks in the sand. Since she weighed about 250 and wore a large shoe, it wasn't hard to know her tracks. I followed the horse's tracks until I was sure they were headed to the C7. I could tell that the horse was heavily loaded and traveling fast. I followed the tracks and was soon able to tell the little horse was tiring from his load and was being pushed hard. George and Mattie had come to Dakota from Palo Pinto County, Texas. They had come to the homestead, but were short of money and had to work a year or two before taking up a claim. George had been hired to ride the fence. When I was within 2 miles of the C7, I came upon the little pony they had ridden. He was dead and stiff. I could see the prints of the chain upon his hind legs and flanks, where he had been beaten as he carried his double burden. I was mad and determined to find out what had brought on such brutalness. I wanted to know why George would beat his horse to death. As I neared the ranch house, the cook came to meet me and was laughing hard as he met me. I was upset and went straight to the corral, ignoring his foolishness. He knew why I was there. I knew Adams and his wife had pulled some crazy stunt which had cost the life of a pony. I had ridden 20 miles in little more than an hour, so my own horse was in need of rest and food. The stable boy told me where I could find George. He told me that he was in the house in bed, or bathing his wife's legs where he had beaten them with a chain that morning trying to escape the Indians. I rushed into the house and was met at the door by Mrs. Hardy. She laughed and asked if the Indians were on the warpath. Mrs. Hardy told me the story. About 7 o'clock this morning, I heard someone running down the trail from the potato cellar to the house while I was in the backyard feeding the chickens. I looked up and saw Mrs. Adams in her nightgown and her mouth wide open. The fear of death was upon her ashen face. George was so close behind her with their baby in his arms, and it was dressed in his nightgown too. I didn't know what to think. Finally, Mrs. Adams gasped out that the Indians were chasing them. She repeated it again. The Indians are after us. They did not stop, just kept on running with her long hair all down her shoulders and the face. She ran until she got to the door of the kitchen at the bunkhouse, and she jumped into the cook just as he started out of the door with a pan of dishwater, which, of course, caused him to spill all over both of them. This caused the cook to use some foul language in front of her. I stopped George long enough to find out what had happened. He told me that this morning at daylight he heard an Indian give the war whoop, and when he looked in the direction that it came from, he saw 3 Indians and their ponies. He told Mattie he would get to the horses after the little pasture and go to the ranch, but when he got back to the gate, he saw the Indians coming down the hill. His wife then met him at the gate, climbed up behind him with the baby in his arms, and they started from there. They rode the little pony to death, then ran the rest of the way here. Mrs. Hardy also told me that the Adams hadn't been there long when the 3 Indians came with a ridge, and George wanted the cook and the stable boy to help kill them. They had come on the barn and had given the stable boy the bridle and chain that Adams had left the poor dead pony. They told the stable boy a large herd of cattle was being driven across the lower end of the C7 ranch, and that there were many C7 steers in the herd. They were trying to get word to me. That was why he yelled at the Adams at that place that morning. They were hungry and had thought he would give them something to eat. Mrs. Adams had been beaten with a chain George had used to whip the pony with. Mrs. Hardy put her to bed, bathed, and poulticed her legs and feet, and George stayed with her. Mr. Hardy was at Fort Yates, and I told Mrs. Hardy I would talk to George. Mrs. Hardy tried to get me to go by the cow wagon and get all the hands before I went after the herd. I ate my dinner while I talked to George. I let him know how foolishly it acted. He looked as though he had stolen something and been caught in the act. I asked about his wife. I told George I had no use for a man who would get scared. He decided on his own to leave the ranch just as soon as Mattie was well enough to travel. I asked the cook to put up some of the provisions for me as I would be gone several days. I wanted to overtake the herd before it crossed the Missouri River. Then I asked the stable boy to send word to Fort Yates to the officers there. From what Mrs. Hardy told me about Mattie Adams' condition, I felt she might be crippled for some time. I asked George why he had hit his wife with a chain, and he said she kept telling him to hit the colt harder. She never told him he was beating her legs off. I sent George for his things in a wagon, for his wife and baby would need their clothes soon. I checked on Mrs. Adams. I looked at her bruised legs and told Mrs. Hardy the woman would have to see a doctor at once. I told them to wrap her legs in flaxseed meal poultice until they could get help. I rode that evening and all night. At daybreak, I rode on top of a high hill, dismounted, and pulled my saddle from my tired horse and staked him out to graze. While it was getting light, I ate some cold breakfast. I knew that if the herd hadn't passed the hill sometimes before morning, they would be near enough for me to see them good after daylight. I was right, for as I finished eating, I walked to the northeast end of the hill, and not over 1 mile away I could see a herd of cattle just leaving their bed ground. I could see the camp not far from the herd. The herd was headed so it would pass in less than a mile from where I stood. I needed to get near enough to see the brands on the cattle before I made myself known to the men and their boss, so I led my horse unsaddled down the opposite side of the hill from the herd and into a clump of timber. I left him to graze while I took another look at the herd with my field glasses. When I was near the edge of the hill, I saw a lone horseman coming towards me in a gallop. I knew I'd been seen by someone, or this one would have been sent ahead to look over the country. I got behind a large rock and a bunch of bush and waited. As soon as I heard the horse's feet on the stones, I climbed the hillside. I could hear the squeak of leather as the horse's sides heaved as he climbed the hill. As soon as he was on top of the hill, about 200 yards from where I was hiding, he went a little past me and stopped. I took out his field glasses and began to scan the country. I placed my rifle so it would point directly towards him. I wanted to see if it's sticking from the bush. I eased a few feet to one side, then stood up in plain view. When he turned his head, he stopped with his back to me and was looking through his glasses. He had both hands on the glasses, focused on some object. "Hands up!" I quickly demanded, assuming this man was Tom Fly had warned me about. "I want this one alive," I said, pretending to be talking to my man on the rocks. I took his guns and got his rifle from his saddle holster and told him he could lower his hands. I ordered him to dismount. He turned so he could see the rifle, and I had placed it for him to see. I slipped handcuffs on him and asked him where he was headed with the herd. "Have that man lower his rifle," he said. "He won't shoot unless I say so." He wanted to know what I planned to do with him. I told him I would look over the herd first. When we got to my horse, I unlocked one wrist took his coat and hat. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "Cattle from the C7 ranch," I replied. I mounted his horse and rode away after locking him to a limb of a tree. I kept out of sight until I could come up on the opposite side. When I reached his herd, there were 7 men with the herd, a horse wrangler and a cook. 9 in all. I'd never seen a harder-looking bunch. I noted several different brands as I rode down the side of the herd. The first man I wanted to know was why I was riding the boss's horse. I told him I had known their boss back in Texas and that we'd traded horses. This did not necessarily satisfy them, but we kept a close watch on each other. I never turned my back to any of them. I ate dinner with them and hoped old Captain McBride had gotten my message. I rode off to see if I could see McBride coming. I met him on the trail, and that the old Irishman wanted to know why I hadn't arrested the whole damn bunch at noon. I told McBride to come out about a mile from the herd that night and camp, and make sure that they were not seen by the men, and if they wanted the herd to capture them. If they saw the captain and men with him, they would vanish overnight. I went back and released my prisoner. Since I had left my horse untied, it was 10 that night before I could find him. That night I moved in on closer to the outlaws' camp, rolled up my blanket, and went sound asleep for the first time in about 40 hours. It was already 1 in the morning, and awfully cold to be sleeping on the ground, so I was up early circling the rustlers' camp trying to locate McBride again. I could see a campfire nowhere, and had decided that the outlaws had gone deserting their cattle, for they were having to leave the bedground and no riders were in sight. I waited for someone to show up, but about sunrise I saw 4 men coming around a little hill not far from me. I turned my field glasses on them and saw it was a captain and his men on foot. I rode over to meet them and have never seen a madder bunch. They came as near the herd as cattle as they dared to come that night, and staked their horses and turned in for a night going without coffee to keep from building a fire. One of the men could not sleep, so he got up and went to restake the horses, only to find no horses at all. He went back, woke the others, and they had been walking the rest of the night. They had circled around their camp looking for the horses, and when they decided to try to get some more sleep, they couldn't find their beds, saddles, or food. McBride had left his Stetson at his bed, and his bald head was burning in the sun. When he saw my prisoner grinning at him, he snapped, "You need to be so smug, or I'll take that hat and your horse." I gave McBride my hat and my horse to calm him down. Then one of the men spoke out of turn. "Cochrain, maybe you had your horses stolen for all we know. I kind of believe you would do that kind of thing." I knew if the situations had been in reverse, McBride would have been laughing himself silly at me. But he was taking this quite seriously. I ignored the man's accusations and told McBride I would have taken the prisoner from Bullhead and turned him over to Mr. Smith for safekeeping. It was about 50 miles from where we were, and I figured the prisoner and I could take turns riding. I suggested to McBride that one of the men go to Mobridge and get fresh horses for the rest of them. I left them looking after me. I hadn't gone over half a mile when I heard the horse coming up beside me. It was McBride. He had tied a handkerchief on his bald head, making him look somewhat comical. He said, "Tex, here's your hat. The men didn't mean anything by saying you look like our horses. We just were worn and hungry. Besides, all of us have blistered feet. Who in the hell would have thought those outlaws stealing all we had to eat?" I asked him where he had made camp. He said he didn't know because it was dark and when they bedded down. He said he would know the place if he saw it again, though. I suggested we take a look. I told him my prisoner and I would go one way and he could travel in the other, and we'd both travel in a circle, keeping a sharp eye out for the tracks of 7 horses ahead of cattle. McBride said, "I'll go with you." We stayed together and went due north, stopping at a small hill. I was looking over towards the east when I heard the captain exclaim and looked up at him to see what was wrong. He was grinning like a traveling rat. It spotted 7 head of horses and 4 saddles and 2 beds. That was their camp, right where they had left it. I told him to go back and get the others, and bless me if he didn't head out in the wrong direction. I called him back and pointed the right direction to him. He rode off shaking his head. As soon as McBride brought me my horse, I took my prisoner onto Bullhead. That outlaw signed his name as Tom Ketchum. I laughed and said, "Who says you're Ketchum?" But he made no further comment, and was taken to the guardhouse at his government post. He broke out some 3 weeks later. I hired 5 Indians there, went back and got a herd of cattle that had been turned loose about 25 miles from the east side of Morris Holdings. There were cattle in the herd that belonged to Montana and North Dakota, showing that they had been driven over 2,000 miles before they had been bothered. Most of the cattle belonged to men who owned less than 100 head. I learned later that some of the cattle had been missing from their range for about 6 months or so. The rustlers would be found to buy the stolen cattle as soon as they had crossed the Missouri River. It was more than likely someone was waiting to market the cattle at one time. I went from Bullhead back to the ranch. George Adams and his wife were still there. She was in terrible shape and unable to get out of bed. The doctor had been out to check on her and left the cell for treatment, but she wasn't healing fast. I soon went back to the cow wagon to check on the hands. I took the mail out to them. I learned Ben Steen was making a real hand now. The boys told me Charlie made sure he was glad that I was back, for he needed a new pair of pants. He had worn out his only pair, and didn't have the money to buy with. He had lost his money in a crap game. Ben had lost all his money, too, and he surely did look ragged. I knew that Mr. and Mrs. Hardy would be on the wagon the next day, so I gave Charlie a pair of pants I had in my bedroll. They were about 2 sizes too small, but he squeezed into them all the same. Ben was not presentable to meet Mrs. Hardy, so he didn't come to the roundup the next day, though he helped make the drive. He stayed out of sight and would not come to get his dinner. He got hungry and went into a thicket of bulrush, and he began grazing on the bullberries to satisfy his appetite. He disturbed an old she-bear and her 2 6-month-old cubs, and the old bear decided she would pounce on Ben. She made a sneak attack upon him and almost up on him before he knew it. He put up an awful foot race to save himself from being hugged by that bear. It was not over half a mile from the roundup. Mrs. Hardy was sitting on her horse watching the work, and she heard him as he yelled for help. The bear had cut him off from his horse, and he was headed for the roundup for dear life, scarcely out of reach of the bear. Mrs. Hardy was looking towards the creek where I knew Ben had stopped. I saw one of the boys leave the roundup on that side and start off in a dead run. Mrs. Hardy followed after him. I saw Mr. Hardy start from the middle of the roundup, very nearly causing a stampede. He ran his horse through the herd, and soon I heard shot after shot being fired. It wasn't long until Mrs. Hardy came back. She told me that the bear had caught a man and had torn all his clothes off but his boots, and that Mr. Hardy and John Young, the cowboy who had left the roundup ahead of her, had shot the bear, but hadn't killed it. It had gone back into the bulrush on the creek, and Mr. Hardy wanted me to come and help him kill it. I asked her if the cowboy was dead. She said no, but that his clothes were strings and rags, and he had gone to the wagon. Mr. Hardy didn't know where the bear was, but had seen the cubs. The men circled the thicket and went into it. I had not gone far until I found blood on the ground and knew the old bear was wounded. I knew if she would charge me. I hunted the thicket out pretty well, and had almost given up when I looked in the branch of one edge of the thicket and saw the old bear and her young ones. I motioned to the others to come. Mrs. Hardy cried out for me not to shoot those bears. The two little ones were putting mud in the old bear's side where she had been shot. The blood was flowing fast. Both were working as faithfully as little children would to save their mother. Mr. Hardy and John took the little cubs to the ranch, and I put the old bear out of her troubles. One of the little cubs hanged itself that night by climbing into the wagon bed and cutting a rope around the wagon bow and jumping out of the wagon. The rope was not long enough to let its feet touch the ground. But the other cub became as tame as a dog and was a favorite with the boys. But Ben could never stand him to put his paw in his pockets as he did the other cowboys, who usually carried sweets for the little fellow. I was on the ranch one day about 2 months later, and one of Mr. Hardy's friends happened to be there and had taken a fancy to Milt, the cub. He had been sitting on his shoulder and was smoking a cigar. He was just telling Mr. Hardy that he was going to take Milt back to Chicago when he went. He offered $100 for him. He drew a mouthful of smoke and pulled down Milt's head and blew the smoke into the bear's face. The cub jerked his head loose from him and drew back his little paw and slapped the man right in the face, knocking him out of his chair. Milt screamed and scampered out of the room as if he knew he was going to get a whipping. The man was so mad that when he got through blowing this from his nose, he told Mr. Hardy he wouldn't have that damn bear, and he would give him $10 to let him shoot it. Everybody got a big laugh out of it because Hardy told him he shouldn't have blown smoke in the cub's face. Mr. Pence was shipping cattle in from Texas and Old Mexico almost every 24 hours, and all hands that could be spared were at the ranch branding and spraying cattle. I was working almost night and day. Mr. Hardy had been called to Evarts to attend court. Evarts was on the east side of the Missouri River, south of Mobridge, and about 100 miles from Morristown. The Milwaukee Railroad had its terminus there. To my way of thinking, there are a few things more tragic than a town that has crumbling to nothing. Sometimes between 1905 and 1909, Evarts became a ghost town, and LeBeau became a frontier shipping point on the East Bluffs above the Missouri. And LeBeau, Dode, the only son of one of the most influential raw western cowboymen, Murdo McKenzie, was shot to death by Bud Stevens. Dode was shot in the Pile de France saloon, which had been once headquarters for the Dakota part of the Matador Land and Cattle Company. Dode was working for his dad, who was handling the Matador affairs at the time. But Stevens had been a former cowboy on the Matador back in Texas. Stevens was somehow acquitted, but it was generally felt that this was one of the most wantonly cruel murders on those wild cattle kingdom days. No doubt it sounded like a deep-toned death knell for the frontier shipping point of that town, and it, too, was to be destined to crumble to nothingness. Dode had befriended Bud many times. It seems a little trading post town was a festive mood for Christmas when 3 shots cut through the chilly December morning, and a young man whose only fault was whiskey clutched at his chest where the first bullet had struck, then vainly staggered for the door of the Stevens and maliciously pumped 2 more shots into his back. His victim then stumbled to the dusty street and died in the arms of Ambrose Benoist. LeBeau was established in 1875 by a black-bearded Frenchman, Antoine LeBeau, but the town died out a long time due to railroads bypassing it. Later years, Milwaukee and St. Louis ran a spur out to it, and a bit of life was pumped back into the little place. A few months after Dode Mackenzie, David G., died in her streets, a fire started on Main Street that caused the loss of many dollars. The town continued to struggle, somewhat half-heartedly, to survive and rebuild. The matador began pulling cattle out of the Dakota Range. No matador herd entered from the bow. Matador cowboys stayed away from the town. 2 months after the first fire, a second struck, and the once lively little shipping point ceased to exist, except for caved-in cellars, crumbling sidewalks, broken brick, and high weeds. Even the railroad tracks were pulled up. Dode was buried in Trinidad, Colorado, and Murdo Mackenzie, tycoon of the Old West, lived out his life a heartbroken man. Thus, another chapter of the Old West was closed, a town and its excitement regulated to history.